In my last video, I tested out a new series and you guys were pretty vocal about me doing more like it. So I present to you Volume 2 of Scary Stories to Relax to. I saw some of your comments saying the rain volume was too low, so I turned it up for this one. Let me know if it sounds right to you. I'd like to perfect it for you guys. Anyway, we have 5 stories tonight. Story 2 is read by my good friend Vidith22. Be sure to show him some love for helping out. I love making content for you guys, but sometimes a little bit of help goes a long way. Plus, he's great at what he does, and working with him is always an honor. His channel link is in the description if you want to check him out. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors. Story 1 was written by me, so I had a lot of fun writing that for you guys. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. I would love to share your story with everyone here. Likes and comments are always appreciated if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Some people grow up in the city, some people grow up in the middle of nowhere. I'd like to believe both have their perks and fallbacks. Growing up in the city might mean you miss out on roaming the town with your friends, free of adult supervision. Growing up in a small town surrounded by an everyone knows everyone community ensures many dangers are overlooked. I grew up in a small town, and always pitied those who missed out on the freedoms I was blessed with. That is, until that day. You see, I never imagined anything bad could happen to me. No one ever does, I suppose. Sure, we had some urban legends, like how the abandoned church had a female spirit that could be seen in the bell tower at midnight. This myth was ultimately busted by a few of my buddies and I breaking in and climbing it ourselves for that up-close and personal view. We never saw anything, but Robert swore he did. He took off running down the steps screaming, and when we finally caught up with him, he was outside dry heaving and had pissed his pants. Unless spirits have the ability to control a living person's bladder, this turned out to be a rumor to scare us. Needless to say, he was made fun of endlessly for getting scared about nothing. Robert was always the type to try to scare us. He was a practical joker, and though no one else thought so, I thought he was just trying to really sell it. Looking back on it now, I think him peeing himself would have been a bit too far to bring a joke. The thing that did scare me, however, was the cornfields. If the adults and older kids really wanted to scare me, this would have been a more effective way to do it. For context of the story, this takes place in the late 90s. I was 14 and pretty much free of any of the few strict rules my parents had on me. Again, I lived in a tiny town. The population was just over 1,000, nestled into the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Summers were always the best. No school, no responsibilities, endless land to explore, and a close group of friends I could always count on to be available. My best buddy, Cole, lived about 2 miles outside of town. Cole was a no-bullshit, straightforward guy. Even so, he was the type of person you'd want on your side, because he'd get to the bottom of anything. We always had the best time on his family's farm. 4-wheelers, go-karts. Hell, if we were lucky, we'd even get to drive his brother's old Bronco and rip up the land out behind the small forest in his backyard. You're probably wondering how this ties in with the overall story. Well, I'd often hang out until late at night, sometimes as late as 1 or 2 a.m. This would mean I'd have to bike a lonely, desolate road to get back home, surrounded by cornfields on either side. I'd also have to pass an old graveyard around the halfway point. That part, surprisingly, really didn't bother me much. The only fortunate part about any of this was Cole's long driveway. I could use to gain as much speed as I could to bolt those 2 miles. Riding in the middle of the night, alone, I don't think paranoia is unreasonable. This goes beyond paranoia. I could swear I sensed something else with me, every single time. It gets worse. Have you ever driven past cornfields with the passenger window down? If you haven't, try it sometime. You'll notice the sound of your tires reverberates through the stalks of corn. Now imagine that, but on a bike, by yourself in the middle of night. The sound was strikingly similar to as if someone was running through the cornfield alongside me. Again, this was the 90s, so it's not like I could really research fucking wavelengths in the corn, being a 14-year-old kid with a chip on his shoulder. I wasn't going to confess my paranoia to anyone either. I remember how much fun everyone made of Robert for pissing himself. What would they say to me if I spoke up about this? So I did what anybody with a brain would do. I tried my best to ignore it. Moving on, it was a night in August. clear skies and no wind. I'll spare you the details of the day. To summarize, I went out to Cole's around 5 p.m. We spent the day riding the trails we had built and played Super Nintendo late into the night. Cole was passing all of my high scores in every game we played. I didn't mind, but he kept on insisting I was getting mad about it. I wasn't. Time flew by, and before I knew it, it was 1 a.m. It was time to go. Staying the night would have been preferred because my nerves were on high alert, like a sixth sense. But staying the night wasn't something we ever did, for some reason or another. We said our goodbyes, and I stepped out into the cool night, hopped on my bike, gained my usual speed, and I was off. I got about a quarter mile down the road, still pedaling as hard as I could. The sounds from the cornfield was overbearing. You would have sworn Cole's dog was running with me just one row in. The smart thing to do would be to not think about it, keep pedaling, and keep my eyes on the road. The sound, though, it was getting to me. It was driving me mad. I slowed my pace a bit, and with it, the sound died down with the speed. Okay, it's just the noise of my bike. The next thing that happened should have been a red flag. The noise stopped. Completely. I look over at the cornfield and nothing looks off. Despite all logic, I felt relief. I take my eyes off the cornfield and put them straight ahead once more. Right in front of me was a black figure. I had no time to react before I was clotheslined off my bike. I hit the ground hard. I was dazed and it sounded like a flashbang had gone off. Knowing I was in danger, I tried to get back on my feet and run, but my attempt was fruitless. I was being dragged by my foot towards the cornfield. I didn't take the time to look at this thing. I started kicking and flailing, doing anything to make it lose the grip it had on me. I lunged myself forward with my hands and kicked out with my free leg as hard as I could. Connecting with the face of this thing, its grip slipped and it fell backwards with my shoe. I got up and took off running. I didn't take the time to figure out which direction I was facing. Instead, I just ran. I could hear it gaining on me. The footsteps were rapidly approaching. I saw a single light in front of me. It was the graveyard. I knew there was no way this would help me, but I at least knew I was halfway. Reaching the graveyard and standing in front of its gates, completely exhausted, I realized the footsteps had completely stopped. Where did it go? My question was soon answered when I saw the creature's silhouette just past the graveyard, standing in the road. What was I going to do? I turned around thinking about running back to my friends, but as I did, I heard the same noise in the cornfield, the fastest I had heard it yet. Within what had to be 2 seconds, it was now standing in the road between Cole's house and I. How was it so fast? This can't be the end. I have so much more life to live. The odd thing was, it just stood there, as if it was waiting for me. Out of options, I stood staring at the silhouette for what had to be 10 minutes. I felt sick. I was going to pass out, whether that be from the fall, the exhaustion, or fear. I leaned up against the gate, slouched down, and collapsed. I woke sometime later. It's impossible to tell you how long I was out for, or if I even passed out at all. I don't know. But when I glanced up, I finally got my first real look at the creature. His head was poking through the corn stalks across the street. He had on a hoodie. He had these bright, glowing white eyes, and the widest grin I had ever seen. He looked like a serial killer about to devour his last meal. I don't know how else to explain that grin. His skin was dark and leathery, as if he had been rotting away for some time. The fear I felt was more than I could take. I passed out once more. I awoke with the biggest headache I have ever experienced. Imagine dropping an anchor on your head. Opening my eyes seemed like a task far too difficult. The memories of the previous night began flooding my mind. It couldn't have been real, could it? Oh, there's no way. I'd open my eyes to find myself in bed. Everything would be fine. It had to be a nightmare. Except, my bed isn't this hard, and the birds are never this loud. Upon opening my eyes, it was confirmed. It was all real. I jolted up remembering where the man had been, but there was nothing. I walked back to my bike, which was in the middle of the road untouched, and pedaled slowly until I got home. It was apparently still pretty early, just past 7 a.m. to be exact. Too early for my parents to be awake to start getting ready for work. Still exhausted, I laid in my bed hoping sleep would take me over. It never did. I lied awake in bed all day, and passed out later that night. After that night, I became a recluse, the runner, as I would later dub this creature, ran through my mind every single day. I didn't go out anymore that summer. Despite friends coming over constantly to check up on me, they'd eventually give up. The same way I gave up making sense of that day's events. School went back in session and life moved on. You see, legends like this should end after a one-time encounter. The only way these things come back to haunt you is if you let it. I made the biggest mistake of my life at the end of that school year. Maybe my second biggest mistake. I don't know. It's tough to say. Either way, if I would have kept my mouth shut, this would be the end of the story. There's a chance I could have gotten past this at some point, but no, I had to fuck it all up. Robert was always a close friend. It was only natural for him to pull me aside one day after school. He cared. He always did. Remembering the incident at the church, I thought he would believe me. If there was someone to open up to, it had to be him. He had me basically pinned in the corner. Explained how everyone was concerned about me. He said he just wanted to know what was going on, so I told him everything. It felt good to finally get everything off my chest. He was silent for a time. Turns out I was right to think he'd believe me. He brought up the night at the church. We hung out that night, talked about both of our stories and the lasting effects of them for hours. Summer started and I still wasn't ready to go out. Robert would come over from time to time and I could tell the fact I wouldn't go out bothered him. It built up for a couple months until it was August once more. It was an average day. I had spent my morning reading and playing video games in the living room. It was around 6 p.m. when I got a knock at the door. It was Robert and Cole. I had been right that Robert would trust me. Even so, I was wrong to think he'd keep it to himself. Cole questioned me about that night immediately once I opened the door. He asked me why I let fairy tales get to my head. This was classic Cole behavior. Always the logical, get to the bottom of things type. I didn't know what to say, but that didn't matter. He had already made up his mind on how to bring this to a close. His plan was to bring Robert and I out to the same road at midnight and take 10 steps into the cornfield. He would prove once and for all that there was nothing to be afraid of. It goes without saying that I begged him to not do it. I'm ashamed to say that my pleas came with a few tears. Of course he didn't listen, but what else could I do? I couldn't let him go out there and potentially be killed by the runner. I had to go with him. So we pumped up my bike's long since deflated tires, waited until 11:50, and set off into the night. My parents not questioning why, just happy to see me finally leave the confines of their home. The ride out there was silent. No cicadas, no rustling in the corn, no conversation, no anything. Just the sound of our tires on gravel. We were about 100 yards short of the graveyard when Cole stopped and said, "Here." I would have continued my pleas. I would have said anything if I could. But no, I was too terrified to choke out any words. Cole grabbed out his pocket watch and waited until it struck exactly midnight. I assume he was trying to subdue Robert's fears of the church by meeting the specific time of his encounter as well. He began walking into the corn. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Got to 9 when he let out a blood-curdling scream. My fight or flight kicked in and I wouldn't let Cole be taken by that thing. I tore into the cornfield after him and found him laughing. Nothing had happened. He was fine. "You really believe this shit, don't you?" he said while barely containing tears of laughter. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was nothing to fear after all. Maybe, just maybe, I had imagined everything. Even though I was mad about this prank, I felt relieved and let out a nervous giggle of my own. We walked back out of the cornfield together and looked up to see Robert standing in the middle of the road sitting on his bike. "That's not funny, Cole," he yelled. We were climbing up the small ditch, looking down at our feet to ensure we wouldn't trip and slide back down. "Robert, look out!" Cole shouted. Great, another prank. But the runner, he was standing right behind Robert, that same sick and twisted grin stretching from ear to ear. Robert never had a chance. The runner grabbed a hold of Robert and began dragging him and his bike into the cornfield. Robert screamed and we tried our damnedest to catch up with them. It was useless. Once they were in the corn, they were gone. The runner was fast and had to be dragging him at 60 miles per hour through the corn. Robert's screams continued for minutes on end, miles and miles into the corn. That's the end. Robert was never found. Search parties looked for him for weeks. His parents haven't given up the search to this day. No one ever believed us, and honestly, I don't blame them. I don't know what the runner did with him. Cole never forgave himself and ended up going insane. I guess his logical brain couldn't process it. Maybe the guilt got to him. I don't know. What I do know is that I now live as far from corn stalks as I can get. I live in the desert of Nevada now, and try my best to lead a normal life day by day. I don't know if the runner is still out there. People go missing without a trace all the time. Perhaps the night of my first encounter, the runner didn't run to the other side of the graveyard. There's a chance it could have been a friend of his. But after seeing how fast he dragged Robert, it's safe to say either is possible. I don't know for sure, and I hope I never do. I don't have a definite reason as to why the runner didn't take me when I was at the gates of the graveyard. My best guess is that he can only traverse the cornfields and roads in between, but again, I don't know for certain. So I ask, what do you hear when you're whizzing by a cornfield? Do you hear nothing? Or do you hear the faint sound of footsteps? Which one is worse? Maybe if you hear nothing at all, he has already caught up with you.
I used to drive trucks in the military, so when I left the service, it was only natural for me to step into driving cargo all over the United States to make an income. I've been just about everywhere in the US, and because of my background, almost nothing scares me. I've driven through backwash towns so desolate and isolated that one could easily imagine that the residents peeping out at you from their windows were mutated cannibals. I've driven roads so icy and treacherous that Antarctica would be jealous, and I've been stranded in the desert with several flat tires after running over someone's metal debris in the dark. I still have no idea how someone lost so much scrap metal and didn't notice. Suffice to say, I'd never felt scared whilst driving alone on the road. Or at least, I hadn't until recently. I was driving through a desert in Utah. It was late, and I knew I was in for an all-night haul. The road itself was long, dark, and empty. But I noticed I was seeing weird objects along the side of the road at regular intervals. Now, when I say objects, what I mean by that is, occasionally, there would be a dead tree that happened to be close enough to the road for me to see, that had what I thought were strings weaved into its branches. The strings were vaguely in a pattern, I guess. They reminded me of spider webs, and more often than not were items tied into the pattern. I thought I saw animal bones in a couple of them, clothing, or maybe just torn cloth, skulls, bits of random junk, and hair, like a horse's tail or really long human hair. I couldn't tell which. Each one was different, but they all had the same feel to them, and seeing them as often as I had made me a little uneasy. The last one I saw was two dead trees leaned over the road that were connected by strings, like some sort of entryway or theme park gate or something. After I drove through that one, there weren't any more. Now don't get me wrong, driving through deserts at night, you get used to seeing all sorts of weird shit normally. But I wasn't going to stop to examine these things just in case they were some kind of trap. Hell, for all I know, they could have just been some modern art on display. Either way, I wasn't taking that chance, and since I was working towards a deadline anyway, I really didn't have the time to stop either. So don't bother asking me why I didn't stop and take a closer look. You have your answer right there. I first noticed I was being followed sometime after I saw the last tree art voodoo thing. I had driven past an animal carcass that was large and mangled. One thing you should know is that to help pass the time while driving, I've made it a game to try and identify a roadkill. I'm usually quite good at it, but this one was different. So incredibly mutilated, I couldn't tell what it was. Because of this, I was squinting in my rear and side mirrors, trying to figure it out before I was too far away from the light of my truck to see it properly. When movement farther back caught my attention. It wasn't anything overt. It was just that in the distance, I could see a dark shape traveling in the same direction as I was. I could see it because the road and surroundings were a pale color, and the moon was full. It didn't have any lights, which I found strange because it seemed large. I thought it was maybe a car, but it never got any closer or farther. It just stayed the same distance away, ominously following after me. I checked on its progress regularly, and it's safe to say its presence is what spurred me on to my destination. I even arrived about an hour early. By daylight, whatever it was had gone. I don't remember specifically seeing it go, but I do remember noticing its absence with relief. I came to the conclusion that it was probably someone up to something nefarious, perhaps a drug cartel car traveling at night, without lights to avoid being seen or something of a similar nature. After that job was done, I took a couple rest days in a lovely little town. I had a blast of a time, nursed a vicious hangover, and took up another job scheduled for later in the week. When I got back on the road, I had entirely forgotten about being followed. I drove along, making good time towards my new destination. But as the sun started to set, I got an uneasy feeling. That primal gut feeling that something is about to go down. That's what I had. I glanced around nervously, and sure enough, following behind me, was a dark shape silhouetted against the road. It was closer this time, but still not enough for me to make out what it was. By now I had ruled out that I could be a car because of the way it moved, slightly up and down, similar to the gait of a creature, I thought, rather than smooth like a vehicle. I spent so much time watching it that I swerved off the road in more than one place and made myself so nervous that I resolved to stop at the next town's gas station and wait for it to pass me. Luckily for me, the next town wasn't too far off. And once I was inside a building in the presence of other people with a warm beverage, I felt much better. I waited an hour, but whatever it was never passed the gas station. I figured eventually that it may have turned off a different way, and I was probably starting to look like a creep sitting in the corner, so I hit the road again. I was barely on the road for more than 10 minutes before I saw it again, silently trailing after me at the same distance and pace it had been before. I couldn't believe it. I ended up cracking up the radio and chatting over with some other late-night haulers for some comfort. After that night, I started taking day jobs. Deliveries that could be made during the daylight hours were now my preferred. Unfortunately, they're also everyone else's preferred, which means they're much harder to get. I have an ex-wife and 2 kids to make payments to, so the money I make dries up pretty quickly, and within a few weeks I was running short on cash. This was what forced me to take up overnight hauls again. The first night was uneventful at first. The moon was by now considerably disappeared, which made the night darker, but I didn't see anything following me. I took this as a good sign rather than allowing myself to realize that just because I couldn't see it, it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It was a little after midnight, and I was driving under an overpass headed into a city. The road was completely empty, but the streetlights that were spaced out along the top of the overpass meant my surroundings were better lit for a time. Out of general curiosity, I made the mistake of looking in the mirror to see behind me. Illuminated, as it too passed under the overpass, was what had been haunting my nights. For the first time, I could see with relative clarity what it was. It was horses. 2 black horses, with 2 cloaked figures riding them. My jaw dropped. They weren't close enough for me to make out any fine detail, but I could tell for certain that they were horses, and that they were moving far faster than should have been possible. When they were out of the light, they disappeared from my view, as the night was too dark. The only thing that tore my eyes away from the mirrors was the sound of my truck wheels leaving the road again. For the rest of the night, I kept my eyes dead ahead. I didn't want to look back and see how close they were getting, and I didn't want to miss anything ahead of me that might, by any horrible chance, cause me to have to stop the vehicle. Only when morning came did I stop the truck. I was a third of the way to my destination. It was going to be another 2 nights' drive. I broke down. I'm a grown man, and I'm not afraid to say that seeing those horses and those figures chasing me, knowing they'd be chasing me for weeks, steadily getting closer each time I drove, was too much for me to handle. They don't teach you how to handle the paranormal at boot camp. I got only a few hours sleep before setting out again. I thought I could leave early and get most of my driving done during the daylight hours, and pull over when night came. I might be a little late to my delivery, but that didn't matter to me at this point. However, my best plans were disrupted by the plague of road work. The road I had planned to take, which I had calculated would get me halfway to my destination in the least amount of time, and before the sun set, was closed off. Instead, I was rerouted down a dirt track which slowed my progress considerably. As dusk approached, I felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I wondered how close they'd be this time. The moon is almost gone. I wondered what would happen when they finally caught up to me. I concluded I didn't want to know. Then, up ahead, I spotted a figure walking alongside of the road. I'd seen enough of these types of people in my time traveling, so I knew immediately that it was a hitchhiker. Normally, I don't pick them up. I have places to be, and who knows what kind of a person you'd be letting into your truck. But this time, I was so desperate for company that I did. The kid stuck his thumb out, and I pulled over. He was young, early 20s from the south, apparently heading north on the trip of a lifetime, as he told me. And his name was Marcus. Marcus talked fairly consistently as we drove and was getting too excited for my tastes, but I didn't mind as much as I normally would have. Having the constant chatter was a welcome distraction from the pursuers. I knew what was coming with the nightfall. Once it was dark, I kept my eyes focused ahead. I wasn't going to look behind me this time. I didn't want to know. We were only an hour into the dark before Marcus suddenly became quiet. I looked over to see he turned in his seat, staring back out the window. Without looking at me, he asked in a shaky voice, "Can you drive faster?" I set my jaw firm and pressed harder on the gas. I knew he could see them. In a way, I was glad. Part of me considered that I was going crazy from the long hours, or that I had developed some sort of PTSD-induced hallucination. It was at this point that I couldn't help it. I needed to know how close they were. My eyes flicked to my side mirror, and what I saw will haunt me until the end of my days. At first there was nothing, just an empty road lit periodically by the overhead streetlights as we drove. Then suddenly, I could see them. Riding beside the driver's side of my truck and visible in short glimpses, I could see a single horse with a rider. I guessed the other must be on the passenger side. The horse I was seeing was emaciated and rotting. There wasn't any blood on the animal, but it ran on broken hooves, and the rotted-away flesh had fallen off in chunks, leaving patches where one could see that its tendons were snapping back and forth over the bones of its legs. There wasn't any steam or anything coming from the horse's nostrils, though they were flaring with effort, and its eyes were not demonic red as I had been expecting. Instead, its eyes were gone. I imagined they were gouged out long ago, as the sockets were just empty, covered over with skin. The rider itself was by far the worst part. It looked like an old woman gone mad, skeletal with bony fingers clutching the reins, long hair blowed back in thinning clumps, and a cloak made of what looked like human skin. Her face was equally as horrifying. She too had gouged out eyes, but somehow I could have sworn she made eye contact with me in the mirror and smiled. A wide, gruesome smile, full of cracked lips and decayed teeth. I'll never get that image out of my head. I held eye contact too long in petrified fear and woke up the following day to a dripping sound in a hospital room. A trace that there had ever been another passenger in my truck. I don't know what happened to Marcus. I shouldn't have dragged the boy into that. Maybe they took him instead of me. Maybe I was hallucinating that I'd picked up a hitchhiker due to lack of sleep. Maybe he was thrown from the vehicle so far they didn't find his body. The speculations swarmed in my brain, but I had no answer. I also didn't know what those ghastly things were or why they started following me. All I know is that it's daylight now, and I can hear the sound of horses' hooves galloping on the road, and the sound is steadily getting louder and louder. Those things won't stop until they get me. That's the only thing I know for sure. Be careful out there, everyone. Next time you're driving late, remember what could be out there. Ignore the glimpses you caught of something unnatural in your mirrors, and don't think about what could be following you. It only encourages them to chase. After my accident, I spent only a few days in the hospital, and my injuries were what you'd expect. Whiplash, scrapes, bruises, a couple of cracked ribs, and a bumped knee. It was recommended that I stay longer to be on the safe side. The doctors were absolutely convinced that I had some sort of head trauma after I told them what happened, but I wouldn't have it. No way, no how was I going to lay in bed all day, watching bad TV and eating food of questionable origin while those things were getting closer. I could hear the sound of hooves on asphalt coming for me. And since I was able to stand, I figured I was probably all right enough to leave. Of course, I didn't know if I was just imagining hearing them or not. I was on some pretty strong painkillers after all. Either way, the medical staff were lucky I didn't just leap up and rip the IV lines out and bolt for the door. They took their time in preparing my release forms, and as I waited impatiently, I silently willed them to hurry up. When I was finally permitted to leave, I made a beeline for the nearest bar to drown my sorrows. I didn't know what I was going to do anymore. My truck was totaled, and I was either having some very deranged hallucinations, or those things were probably still after me. I will admit that by the time I made my way to a shitty little hotel room for the night, I was seriously contemplating ending it all. I sat in defeat with the barrel of a gun to my temple for a long time. My palms were sweating, and my heart racing as I considered my commitment to this course of action. However, it was in that moment when I was about to pull the trigger that I heard the most beautiful sound. The screeching of car tires taking off outside. It brought me sudden clarity. Angel. And my little man, Lachlan. I couldn't do that to them. They were only 6 and 11. They still needed their father, and I'll be damned if I let some old prudes riding decrepit horses get the better of me. It may have just been the liquid courage speaking, but I was suddenly filled with rage and valor. I wasn't going to let these things stop me from living my life. I was going to drive so fast that their damn horses wouldn't even be able to keep up. They'd be eating my dust if they tried to keep chasing me, and I was resolute in my decision. By morning, my head ached, and my spirits were somewhat dampened as I realized the colossal amount of work I had ahead of me to get through this. First on the agenda was to get the insurance claim back for my truck. I'd filed the report while I was bedridden in the hospital, and it was time to give them a reminder and made sure that I was going to get my money quickly. It did take some arguing, but in the end, I was told I just needed to wait a few more days and that the money would be in the bank by the end of the week. Next, I needed to get back home and spend a little time with my kids and let my family know most of what had happened. I planned on leaving out the chased by a horse hag part, though. I wasn't willing to hitchhike after what had happened to Marcus, so I went online and found an affordable rental car. It wasn't anything flashy, just a small sedan, and since I knew the insurance money would be coming in soon, I didn't mind the small expense, as long as it got me where I needed to go. I figured I might even be able to claim back the rate. Now, of course, I stuck to driving during the day for obvious reasons, but by the third day of travel, I was getting impatient, and I knew I'd make it home that day if I just drove into the night a little. I debated with myself for a few hours, but when the time came and it started to get darker, I didn't pull over. I guess I made up my mind without really knowing it, and they'd be eating my dust, right? That's what I told myself anyway. However, despite my self-assurances, I found myself anxiously glancing up at the back mirror more and more excessively as the sun disappeared. Although I gradually began to relax, as even after a good amount of time passing, I still saw nothing. I would look back only to see the road deserted behind me, and I found comfort in the slight relief that the empty road would give. The idea that I might really be crazy began to edge its way into my mind. It made sense. Maybe there never really was anything chasing me. Perhaps I never picked up a hitchhiker. What if none of it truly happened and I had just fallen asleep at the wheel after all? That suggestion surprisingly put my mind at ease. It seemed somehow better to be crazy than to be haunted. I assured myself to lull into the renowned sense of security. It was just about 9 at night. Area, with my headlights illuminating the area immediately before me, as well as a little ways further. I scanned the road ahead, diligently making a pattern of looking right to left, then back again, at regular intervals, as I became less and less concerned with looking behind. The sound of my car's tires on the road was somehow soothing, and with the trees beginning to become sparse, I knew the landscape was changing. The reflective signs ahead informed me of an approaching bend in the road, and I adjusted my speed appropriately. But as I went around the corner, a big rig passed me, going the opposite direction, and despite my best efforts, I found myself mildly dazed by the bright lights. I recall thinking how I now knew what the other cars felt like when my truck went past them, small and blind. However, while I was blinking with purpose to diminish the orbs of light floating in front of my eyes, I saw a dark shape suddenly there in the glare of my headlights. It was incredibly close to my vehicle, and I hardly had time to process what it was as I swerved to avoid colliding with it. I came to a sharp stop, and as the dust swirled around my car, I tried to determine what I had just seen. I looked back and around only to see nothing but the eerie blackness of night. The thing was gone, but a realization sank in slowly and chilled me to the bone. From recalling my brief glance, I came to know that I had seen a horribly decayed horse. With ears flat back against its head and nostrils flaring, it had lifted its rotting front feet off the ground to rear, before stomping back down with force, while perched on the thing's back was the withered creature of my nightmares. The hag just smiled at me with chapped lips and a hollow darkness in those empty eye sockets. She wanted something from me. In the split second we had made eye contact, if you can call it that, I could tell she was trying to communicate, but what she wanted I couldn't say. I waited tensely for something else to happen. I had a Glock 19 in the glove box, and resolved that those bitches weren't going to take me without a fight. A few long minutes passed before I decided, screw it, I'm just going to drive. I slammed the car in gear and tore off down the road like a bat straight out of hell, nothing stopping me or dragging me back, but I didn't care to look behind me either. When I reached the next town, I stopped and checked into a room for the night. I only had a couple more hours to go before I'd make it home, but I wasn't going to keep trekking on after that experience. The night was a restless one, and at some point it occurred to me that if I drove home, I might be leading these things back to my family and to my kids. I couldn't have that. I needed to keep them safe. I then spent the rest of the night wondering what the old crone wanted. She and her demon horse had scared me off the road. I had sat there for a decent amount of time and then drove off. If they wanted to take me, they could have. They didn't. Why? By morning, I thought I had my answer. I only needed to test the theory. I got in my car to drive and started driving. I didn't have a destination, but I had a plan. I drove for hours, and as the sun began to set, I started to feel a little uneasy. It was a nervous sensation, though very keyed up, like I was about to be deployed into combat. By my good fortune, I managed to spot a hitchhiker walking along the side of the road. They were putting their thumbs up for each car that passed, and having no luck, so I pulled up near them. "Hey, do you want a ride?" I asked as I rolled down my window. "Hey, Yeah, man, that'd be awesome, the guy repeated eagerly. He looked like he was in his mid-20s to me, and had a kind of slowed attitude. Too many drugs, I thought. Great. Still, I let him in my car and agreed to drive him as far as he wanted south, telling him I was just on a road trip going where the road took me. I figured that kind of washy answer would suffice for someone of his nature, and it appeared I was right, as he seemed to accept my explanation. We started off and drove for a good while without incident. He talked and I responded minimally, but enough to keep him going. Eventually, he pulled out a joint and asked if I minded. I did, but considering the circumstances, I told him I didn't, and he lit up while I kept an eye on the road. It was by now completely dark, no moon in the sky, which made the darkness even more inky, and I kept my focus on the road markings. Just because there were supernatural monsters chasing me didn't mean I still couldn't get collected by a moose or something, though that would be ironic. I took us down a seldom used back road and felt my heart begin to race as my headlights finally fell on a dark figure ahead of us as it came into view. I wasn't surprised, just nervous as I slowed the car to a stop. Standing in the middle of the road were the two riders. The horse closest to the car snorted and pawed the ground impatiently, its hoof scraping on the asphalt as the flesh hanging off its legs shook and flapped around from the movement. I was fairly sure a piece of the rotting skin would slop off at any moment if it continued. The hitchhiker I'd picked up leaned forward in his seat to get a better look of what was in front of us. At first he seemed confused, just staring at them before looking at the joint in his hand and muttering something about it being strong shit, and not knowing what the hell was in it. I took a deep breath. This was perhaps the only time I could have almost been thankful for the smoke filling the car, as I told him simply, "Get out." He seemed startled when I spoke, then unsure of himself. "But, man, we're in the middle of nowhere, and I'm seeing some weird things," he complained. "I don't care. Get out," I repeated with more authority, to which he, of course, protested further. I started to worry that he wasn't going to do as I asked, and before I knew what I was going to do, I had grabbed the Glock out of the glove box and pointed it at him. I said, "Get out," I growled. Having a gun in his face seemed to sober him up quickly, as he looked out at the gruesome creatures and then back at me. "Seriously, dude?" he asked, his voice starting to tremble with pure terror. "Now," I specified, ignoring his question and repositioning the gun to let him know I was indeed serious. Okay, man, just calm down," he told me, but did finally pop the door handle and step out of the car. "Shut the door," I instructed, while keeping my gaze fixed on him rather than looking at the creatures. Obediently, he did as he was told, and I immediately locked the doors behind him. At this point, he seemed to realize what was going to happen and tried to get back in, despite having heard the doors lock. However, he became entirely more frantic when I began to back the car away. He shouted and begged to let me back in while trailing after the car, but I only gripped the steering wheel harder and ignored his pleading. The horses began to advance as my headlights receded, and I hoped my plan would work. I reversed further, turning the wheel and put the handbrake on rapidly, allowing the car to slide around until I faced the direction I was originally coming from. Then just drove off. I didn't look back. I drove the entire rest of the night all the way home, but they weren't following me. My plan had worked that night, and I knew what I had to do from then on. It's been years now since then, and I get to spend every day with my kids. I even managed to repair the relationship my ex and I had. We got remarried, and I live with my new family again. I've also returned to trucking. I think it gives my wife a little break from me when I take long trips and enjoy the freedom of the open road. I also willingly pick up hitchhikers nowadays. I don't force anyone to take a ride with me. If they say no, I just move on to the next. But those who do get a ride get the best ride of their lives. I let them listen to whatever they want. If they want to smoke or whatever, that's fine too. And if they're hungry, I'll even pay for whatever meal they want. It's the least I can do. I don't bother to learn their names. That's been far too many of them now for me to remember, or even pretend to care to know their names. It's unnecessary. I've gotten better at getting them out of my truck without too much of a fuss, though. Usually I give them lots of water to drink and wait for them to say they need to stop. I don't like doing this, but I have to. For my children, Gracie has just graduated high school and soon she'll be going to college. She's going to be a nurse. She's always been such a kind girl. Lachlan isn't so academically minded, but he's great at his sports. Even says he wants to join the army like his old man. I really couldn't be more proud of him. The riders let me know when it's time to get them another tribute. I know because that's when I hear them the loudest. Normally they're just a dull sound at the back of my mind, but when they want something, they're almost deafening. There have been a couple close calls over the years where I thought I wasn't going to find anyone in time, but I don't regret what I've done. Every one of them did choose to get into my truck. All I really did was make an offer. Though I must say, I don't know if I can keep up the supply to meet the demands of volunteers alone anymore. The riders seem to come to me sooner and sooner, demanding another sacrifice. There's going to be some tough times ahead, so I'll warn you now. If you're out there, walking alone, I'm going to take that as a willingness to help the cause. I simply can't be held accountable for your poor choices. Similarly, if you're someone who's looking to get a free ride across the country, you've always known you should be careful. You can't blame me for what happens next when you were warned. After all, you never know whose vehicle you're getting into.
When you're in your 20s, going out late, drinking, and getting involved in questionable activities is kind of a given. Even if you're a late bloomer with a hint of social awkwardness, it's not long before the party eventually finds you. At least that was the case with me when I was growing up in the Caribbean. I lived on an island called Trinidad, when every Friday was a reason to celebrate. Now while this was pretty easy for some of the city dwellers, for those of us that lived in more rural areas, it was a major challenge. I lived in the southeastern corner of the island in a seafront town called Mayro. We had the amenities of modern Trinidad, but life here was a lot slower, and given the fact that it was a 2-hour-long journey to and from our capital of Port of Spain, it just didn't seem worth it to have to travel that far every time we wanted to drink. And trust me, we drank often. I sometimes look back at that phase of my life and wondered how much of the alcohol-induced blur really happened, and how much of it was my imagination. Sometimes a hangover isn't the only thing you carry with you as evidence of a wild night. One time I remembered getting punched in the face for trying to make out with a guy's girlfriend at a club one Friday. Despite the scrapes, bumps, and close calls while driving, one incident stands out to me the most. At the time I lived with my dad in a heavily forested part of Mayro. 2 of my friends had already turned in for the night and headed back to the suburbs where they lived. They offered to give me a ride home, but I insisted on staying at the bar. I would stay back at bars for hours after my friends left, hoping to hook up with some girl who was left behind or catch a vibe from a group of partiers. And sometimes, I just enjoyed being alone. One man with a cold beer was all the relaxation I needed to escape the mind-numbing boredom of working at the insurance company where I spent my days. Eventually at around 3 a.m., I realized nothing was happening and decided to head home. I lived about 20 minutes from the bar, and I figured if I started walking from now, I would be there before my dad got up. He really raised the roof about me coming home late, and he didn't care much for the drunken, hedonistic whirlpool of a life I've gotten myself into. I walked until the telephone poles and streetlights eventually got further and further apart, until they disappeared altogether. The asphalt and concrete turned a soft dirt road as the crickets grew louder and louder. I was drunk, but I knew where I was. It was a patch of forest just before the Ortor River. On a normal night, this walk would have been eerie and frightening, but I was too far gone to care about whatever ghouls. In fact, these days, we had more to fear from the drug runners that used this route than anything supernatural. The thought of this made me laugh a silly, ugly, drunken laugh. I heard the sound of the river getting louder, and I knew I would be home in a few minutes. There was an old bridge connecting one side to the other. It was there for as long as I could remember. and some of the children in the area have been swept away from the powerful current of the river during the rainy season when they slipped and fell in. The moon was out tonight because I remembered seeing the rust at the sides of the bridge, bathed in a smooth, silver glow. It was a beautiful night, I thought. The kind of night you couldn't appreciate in the city. Maybe there were some perks to being out this far in the country. I walked clumsily along, holding the railings, careful not to fall in, all the while thinking of an excuse to give my dad if he woke up before I got in. He had heard them all over the years, and at this point, I think it would be better for our relationship if he just gave up on me. I wasn't going to be a lawyer like my brother, and I sure as hell wasn't going back to work at my uncle's store. I mean, I went to university. I stopped dead in my tracks halfway across the bridge when I felt the balance of bridge change. The current was little more than a trickle tonight, and it definitely wasn't enough to shift a bridge to the side. I was about 10 scotch and sodas deep. But I had walked on this bridge hundreds of times, drunk and sober, and I've never felt such a change in pressure before. Then I saw it. 2 pale beams at either side of the bridge. This was the first time I remembered seeing this. Must have been a piece of construction, I reasoned. But I couldn't remember seeing any construction equipment this week. It extended a few meters up above the bridge when I began walking again towards it. The glow of the moon made both poles look as if they were made of marble. Then I felt the shift in the bridge again. This time I knew my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. This time the shift of the bridge was followed by a low groan. At first I thought the foundation of the bridge was about to give away, and I held onto the railing with both arms. That's when I heard it. Whatever drunken stupor I was in, I snapped out of it immediately. When I heard a shrill whistle. We lived in Mayrow for most of my adult life, and I've heard it all. Howler monkeys, iguanas, agoutis, and even an ocelot or two. But I've never heard it before. If I had to describe it, it would be the whistle of a steam locomotive from one of those old western movies, with a hint of femininity just beneath the surface. I kept holding on to the railing for dear life even after the shaking stopped. That's when the beams began to move. Dear God, I said aloud. If these massive poles were moving, this entire bridge was going to fall, and I would be trapped under tons of metal. As they moved, I saw their shape, and a chilling realization swept over me. These weren't construction beams. They were legs. What the fuck were they attached to? I looked up and saw what the massive legs were connected to. Standing about 50 feet tall above the bridge with legs on either side was a man, white as snow with long gangly arms extending down to its huge kneecaps. As my gaze focused on him, one of his eyes opened and his lips curled to reveal a sinister grimace. I could feel my face twist in fear as I heard the whistle again. Every tree and rock within a 10-mile radius felt as if it was shaking from that noise. As I saw his feet moving again, I got the urge to start running. I almost slipped and fell twice as the bridge began to shake. I can't remember for certain, but I felt hot tears and sweat running against my cheeks as I heard water splashing as that thing's feet waded through the river. What the fuck is going on? I kept repeating to myself as I ran through the dense underbrush of the surrounding forest. One of my shoes fell off when I almost tripped over a tree root that was half in the earth. That's when I heard the whispering. It sounded like my father calling for me to stop running and relax. Take it easy, boy. Stop running. It grew louder, and my legs began burning, but I had to keep running. I stopped to collect my breath when I realized I stopped hearing the deafening footsteps. I hurried around the forest, taking me about an hour to get around the river and back home. When I finally got to my village, it was after 4 a.m. I felt like I had run a marathon. The front of my shirt was messed up with mud and vomit from the chase. Before I could even get my key out, I heard the door open to see my dad standing in the doorway. I expected him to be angry out of his mind, but he had a look of concern over his face. For a second, he looked 10 years older because of the worried look he wore. Take off your shoes and walk in backwards, he ordered without asking me anything. I opened my mouth to ask why, but I decided to obey him. He had a cup of hot coffee waiting for me in the dining room when I got in. After locking back the door, he sat just opposite of me and studied me closely. You okay? He asked. I took a sip and nodded my head. I had a feeling something happened. I don't know what it was, but it didn't feel like anything normal. He said softly, almost whispering. Without him asking, I told him what happened, how far I was chased. Part of me thought he would dismiss the episode as the ramblings of a drunk, but he listened attentively, even turning his head down to avoid looking at me at some points. After what felt like an eternity, he got up and walked towards his room. "Get some rest. You're safe now," he said. "What was it?" I asked. He paused for a while, but eventually answered, "I don't know. I saw it a couple times when I was your age. Never that close, but I saw it. I don't live in Trinidad anymore. I left a few years after my father died. There was nothing left for me on the island anymore anyway. To this day, I question if what I saw was real, or did I just have too much to drink? Despite living as far away as I do, I can still remember vividly the sound of that thing. Sometimes I'm afraid that it's not just the memory, that one day I will hear it closer." There's something in my hometown. No one really knows how long it's been around for, but at some point, people started disappearing. I don't mean one or two odd people have vanished. I mean roughly half the town is gone now. No note, no evidence, no clues. It's like they vanished without a trace. At least, that's what everyone thinks. It's better to believe they're gone than to know the horrible truth of what's happened to them. What could happen to all of them? I've been working with the police department for a while now. And let me tell you something the locals don't know, and possibly never will. The bodies have been found, but they're not whole. I don't know how to describe it, but it's like they have chunks taken out of them. Like something is eating them. I've seen it with my own eyes. Seen it rip the skin off a cowering child like an animal, like a monster. It looks like a human, it sounds like a human, but deep down, I and everyone else who has witnessed this knows that it couldn't possibly feel anything. No one could look into the eyes of another human being, see the fear and anguish, and still hurt them. Now this is scaring the shit out of everyone. It's getting hard to keep it from going national and cause a mass panic. People are devastated, but can you really blame them? What they're going through is terrible. People have lost their families, people lost their friends, and it's so hard for everyone. But they are so brave. There's still this sense of community and society is still functioning. Even though there's this fear lurking underneath everything. Everyone has silently agreed to never mention it or bring it up. It's just too hard. Could you imagine? They say it's a monster, lurking under the beds and stealing them as they sleep in the night. They say it can sense fear. They say it hunts those who have committed sins. I think this might be because they could never fathom it being one of their own. No one feels safe, but at least they feel like they can trust one another. How else do you cope with something that lurks in the dark? That would strike even the children. Everybody is lying awake at night, terrified of what could be right around the corner, what could be behind them in the mirror. There's no way anyone could have prepared for this, and trust is all we have left. Trust, God bless, is the only thing stopping people from running in the streets, screaming. But I know what it is, because I've seen this thing in the streets. I've seen it merge in society so expertly that not one person has noticed that it's not quite like the others, because I've seen it through the glass, because I've laid my head down on a pillow with it, because I, and no one else, knows how truly delicious human flesh is. Sleep tight. I've been working as an epidemiologist for 8 years. I've always loved my job and have dreamt of studying and stopping diseases since I was just a little boy with a dream. I'm pretty lucky. I have a good paycheck, good family, and a pretty good life. Epidemiologists work to study diseases and preventing outbreaks in groups of people. Now, my job isn't very interesting to a lot of people, and I'm sure it isn't to a lot of you, but you've all read the title. I know why aliens don't visit Earth. To tell you what I know, I have to rewind a little. Being in medical school and working with the sciences, I've never really believed in superstitions or conspiracy theories. In fact, I'm very comfortable with debunking things when I have the chance. But I've started studying the existence of aliens. When I was a kid, I would always imagine a shooting star to be a flying ship like in Star Wars. That was just my imagination. I was going to Google to find some actor's name, and I saw a trending topic of a UFO sighting. I ignored it because of what I talked about earlier, but then my wife forwarded me the link. She knows how much I disagree with these types of things. But I caved and decided to watch it. It was crazy. It's impossible to find on the internet now. Every post gets deleted. I have never seen a video like it. A man was using a telescope and was looking into outer space. He watched Mars for a few minutes, and suddenly something began hovering in front of it. I don't know what to say other than it was not CGI. This was the real deal. It was scary. I'd always believed the one truth of aliens being a hoax as a certain fact. This really did open my eyes. I started rethinking all the theories I debunked. And I remembered a specific one that really sparked my interest. It was something I saw while browsing through Twitter. Didn't have many likes or anything. My half-cousin retweeted it. It went along the lines of, aging is a disease, and Earth is subject zero. It sounded like the plot of a sci-fi movie, but now that I think back, I realize I can test this theory for myself. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'm really good at what I do. I decided to borrow some equipment from the lab. I didn't steal it. I took a sample of some skin from my arm, just big enough to study. I looked at it under a microscope and saw cells dying, decomposing, dying of old age. It wasn't something I've never seen, but I felt differently. Like an inner fire in me said I could find a way to stop the aging. I contacted some coworkers and asked their opinion on anti-aging. Most said it was bogus, but a few gave me very detailed answers on how they think it would happen. I know this is getting long, but I found a compound that worked. After many different tests with different concoctions, it actually worked. I watched cells stop dying and stay in the same state forever. It was almost orgasmic. The thing I had been dedicating my time to finally paid off. Now, what I did next was stupid. I've noticed my hair graying and my skin getting a bit wrinkly. A new batch of beard hairs became gray every few days. But I drank some of the stuff. It's been months and I don't see any changes to myself. My wife thinks I'm crazy now, and I'm just not aging. This is when it gets crazy, so bear with me. It was that very night. The one my wife tore me a new one for being a mad scientist. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, but nothing worked. A blaring noise filled my head. I wasn't hearing it. It was being sent directly to my brain. I couldn't make out words. It was a tone, but there would be pauses. It wasn't Morse code. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard, but I understood it all. Our planet is quarantined. Outside of our view is a giant community of species that live together. The whole universe is full of sentient life, and they've all been warned to stay away ever since the sighting outside of Mars. You may not believe me, but we are all diseased. I changed the course of our planet. Our life cycle can be conquered. Earth is ground zero for a plague, but not anymore. I know why aliens don't visit Earth. They're scared.